You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 25th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme.
It's a whirlwind of emotions. I mean, I'm just elated. Frankly, it's just incredible. I don't know. Feels like it's not real.
It is the end of a more than a decade-long saga. Julian Assange's wife there reacting to the end of his saga in London. Assange is due to plead guilty to espionage in exchange for his own release from jail. We'll speak to a former colleague and journalist. After that, to Israel, where the country's preparations for a second front in the war just got a lot more complicated after the Supreme Court ruled that Orthodox Jews must serve in the military. Then we'll get the latest business headlines, and then we'll be checking in on the Japanese Emperor Naruhito's visit to the UK. And finally, China has been to the moon and back. We'll look at what their lunar lander brought back with it. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. After more than a decade in legal limbo, Julian Assange, founder of Wikileaks, has agreed to plead guilty to charges of espionage in the United States in exchange for his freedom. The deal with the US Justice Department sees Assange flying from the UK to the Northern Mariana Islands, one of the remotest American outposts, for sentencing tomorrow. He will be given 62 months in jail, or pretty much exactly the amount of time he has already served, and will then be free to travel to his native home of Australia. It marks an extraordinary end to a saga that has long aroused passions and legal frustrations on both sides of the Atlantic. Well, James Ball, now political editor of The New European, but formerly a staffer at Wikileaks, joins us now. James, great to have you on the show on this really quite extraordinary development in this long-running case. What do we know about how this deal with the Justice Department came about?
So I'd been hearing rumblings that this was underway for months, and I think it had hit the point where it was in both sides' interest. I don't think either side could honestly call this a win for all that they made publicly, but it was becoming clear that Assange could drag out the extradition proceedings for potentially years longer. He had more appeals in the UK that had been granted, and once he'd exhausted those, he could have taken it to the European Court of Human Rights. And so the US wasn't looking at any rapid conviction, and for the charges that were there, this was probably about the sentence they would have got after a trial. And so an off-ramp for them would be useful. And of course, for Assange, he's been sitting in Belmarsh prison the whole time that this delay has gone there. And so a deal that means he doesn't spend any time in a federal jail, I can see why he will have taken it, even though the idea of pleading guilty to something I'm very confident he won't think is wrong or that he's done must really, really pain him.
Did the US, do you get the sense, just then want to put this behind it, essentially? I do wonder, though, at the same time, whether there will be people kind of angry at the plea deal in the United States, specifically after all of this effort, the legal wrangling, the court appeals over his extradition.
This was always a very strange case that the Department of Justice was bringing. It related specifically to the 2010 Wikileaks documents, which were the ones that showed the scale of sort of death and devastation in Iraq and Afghanistan, that showed the treatment of detainees in Guantanamo and the state cables. Now, these were releases that were sort of seen as so much in the public interest that places like the New York Times, Guardian, global outlets joined in. WikiLeaks has done some more questionable material since then. They've even released actual hacking tools used by the CIA, which then got used by criminals. This prosecution wasn't about that. It was about the 2010 releases. And under Obama, the DOJ didn't prosecute Assange over these because of the threat it would pose to mainstream journalism. And they came out and said that. And so under Trump, this case became public and was continued by Biden. And so it's been quite an uncomfortable case because it does relate to the more journalistic end of WikiLeaks activities. The indictment didn't cover anything else. And so maybe to that extent, they boxed themselves in a corner where they maybe just needed this case to go away.
Now, one thing to ask you, James, specifically, you did work as a staffer at WikiLeaks. I wonder if you could talk a little about Julian Assange and kind of what motivated him and whether you felt like there was a point where either his motivations changed or he wasn't perhaps in this for the reasons he started out being in it.
It's very difficult to pin Julian's motivations down because they tend to change according to his whims and according to who he's talking to. While I'm a big critic of this prosecution, I'm also a critic of Assange. I think people either want him to be a hero or a villain, and he's human. It often felt like he wanted to be a big figure, to be on the world stage. He almost sort of saw himself as an equal to someone like Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. He expected he could pick up the phone and immediately be put through to her. And you've got to be a pretty major world leader for that to be the case. And so for all that it was pushed as high ideals, I think a lot of it was about attention. But he was surrounded by people who were motivated by idealism, and quite a few of those sort of were quite alarmed by things that they saw. The question, of course, is going to be, after 7 years of kind of self-imposed containment in an embassy and then 5 years in jail, you know, is the Assange that arrives a free man in Australia in a few days' time going to be the same man? You know, maybe he'll want some time to recuperate. His health's apparently been quite impacted by all of this. But I don't think he's going to go and sit on a farm quietly or something like that. I think he will resurface, and I suspect he will be harbouring quite a few grudges.
Well, that's interesting. We have no idea really where he's going to go from here, I suppose. It'll be interesting to see. But just one final question for you, James. It's extraordinary the way you describe him, and on the one hand, sort of alienating the US through these releases, but also hoping that Hillary Clinton would pick up his call. I do wonder from that perspective whether you think journalism has kind of learned anything from this and from this saga about that line between press freedom, the power of the press, but also harm to national security, intelligence sources, where that appropriate line is.
I mean, we should stress, I think WikiLeaks has changed journalism, but not turned journalism into a copy of what it was doing. I also worked on the Edward Snowden releases for the Guardian, and we made sure to try and show our working and to put enough of the documents into the public to show that we weren't distorting them and to try and get the message across. But we redacted extremely carefully, and the vast majority of what we saw never went out. But journalists didn't used to show our working. We didn't really used to work on big data sets. Think about all the offshore leaks, the Panama Papers, the work that's been done identifying sort of Russia behind MH17 or other strikes. I think showing data, showing documents, and actually being a bit bolder in doing all of that is the good part of WikiLeaks' legacy on journalism. It's been carried on by some new types of newsrooms, but in traditional papers too. And I think, you know, whatever you think of Assange, it has fostered an era of watchdog journalism that is going to be threatened when you see someone as prominent and well-resourced as Assange forced into a plea deal like this.
Thanks very much, James, for coming on the program. That was James Ball. Now here's Monica Lillis with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Protesters are hitting the streets of Kenya after calling for a nationwide strike, seeking to pressure the government over controversial tax reforms. The government has warned protesters against engaging in violence and has insisted that they must wind up their agitation by 18:30 local time. The number of Koreans moving from cities to find a second life in rural or fishing communities experienced the largest decrease on record in 2023. The numbers increased in 2020 and 2021 when the COVID-19 pandemic hit the country as the job market in cities stagnated. Since then, the figure has continuously fallen. The European Union will open membership talks with Moldova and Ukraine today, giving Kyiv a political boost in the midst of its war against Russia's invasion, although a long and tough road still lies ahead for both before they can join the bloc. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Monica. For months now, Israel's government has been held together by a fragile unity in the face of war with Hamas in Gaza. That unity may now be coming undone just as the risks increase of a second front to the war opening up with Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon. Israel's Supreme Court has ruled that ultra-Orthodox Jews must serve in the military. It's an extremely sensitive and controversial topic that could see the conservative backers of Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu's government exit the coalition, just as rhetoric and the violence along Israel's northern border with Lebanon is reaching a fever pitch. Well, I'm joined now by Alison Kaplan-Sommer, journalist for Haaretz. Alison, there's much to get through here today, but what can you tell us first of all about this Supreme Court ruling and the reaction to it?
Well, it was an expected ruling. The Supreme Court has been falling down on the side of a decision that the government needs to decide whether or not to force ultra-Orthodox Israelis to serve in the army, in equal obligation to non-religious people. And because of their political power, this has been, waylaid. They have not been brought into the army required to do so. But technically, it's always been done by kicking the can down the road legally, not really passing a legislation that formally exempts them. And the courts have basically said, listen, you either need to pass legislation that exempts them or force them into the army with everybody else. And so that's exactly where the Supreme Court has come down on. And now, if push comes to shove and they are being forced to be recruited into the army and the government goes along with it, it could be the end of the Netanyahu government.
Well, that is the point here, isn't it? Specifically, as you say, the Supreme Court basically not allowing the government to kick the can down the road any further. So what has the government's reaction then been? Will they now be forced to make a ruling that essentially ends the coalition, or are they going to find some other way to continue to muddy the waters here?
Well, they can try. They do have the 64 majority, so they could technically pass a law that says, yes, all ultra-Orthodox Israelis do not need to go to the army. But the problem is, even in good times, when there's not war, inside some of the coalition parties, particularly the Likud, Netanyahu's own party, there are individuals who say that they won't go for it, that they believe that there should be service. And it's the worst possible time to do it because Israel is in the middle of a conflict. The army is very vocal about a problem with manpower. It says that it's 11,000 soldiers short. And the Knesset has just passed legislation requiring those in reserve duty to serve an extra year beyond their requirements, due to the current war. So you're at a time when people who are serving in the army are having an extra burden. So it's a very, very, very poor time to try to pass legislation saying that a huge percentage of the population does not need to go to the army at all.
And that is what's quite extraordinary about this, isn't it? I mean, to what extent do you get the sense that Israel, also its military, frankly, is kind of coming undone at this point? We're entering a stage where there might be a second war front opening up with Hezbollah, and yet at the same time, as you say there, the military is warning that it is short of recruits. So what does this ruling mean for Israel's war?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's coming undone. I would say that it's pretty worn out and tired. It does have excellent reserve forces. There's a high level of motivation. There was like 120% agreement for people to go to the army because of this war. They're trying as much as they can to rotate people in and out. But before this war break out, they were sort of actively reducing the size of the army. They said, it's all modern and technological, and they didn't need so many soldiers. and they downsized. So now they're, ramping back up. So I think it would be an exaggeration to say that, it's on its last legs, or there's a real danger to the country because of a lack of number of soldiers. I don't think that's the factor that's going to make or break the success of this war. But it does really put into very bold view the controversy over allowing so much of the country to be exempt from military service in the ultra-Orthodox community.
Well, I guess the question then is, Alison, even if this is not something that makes or breaks the military, as you say, what is the sense there right now of the possibility of a second front opening up with Hezbollah? Tell us about some of the violence. We've been seeing increasing violence on the border between Israel and Lebanon in the north, and how prepared Israel is for this kind of second front opening up.
Well, they're getting prepared now. There's kind of a panic going on. People are buying generators and bottled water and transistor radios, thinking that if a full-scale war did break out, Hezbollah has the capabilities of knocking out the electrical grid in Israel. Since October 7th, there has been a war of attrition on the northern border. Hezbollah, which as we know is an Iranian-backed proxy, is showing its solidarity with Hamas by continuing to attack very, very violently the northern cities in Israel. Israel decided to evacuate many of those cities. Kiryat Shmona and Metula are ghost towns, as are basically the whole area up to 6 kilometers away from the border. And it's a war of attrition. And Hezbollah is becoming, gradually more and more bold, aiming further and further south. But there is, it's clear, most diplomats say that they do not at this point want this all-out full-scale war. It's really, it's not, I wouldn't say it's completely in Israel's hands, but Israeli leaders have to decide how much of this can they take. Can Israel live long-term with this kind of war of attrition and having so many of its citizens displaced and not living there? So, it's a question of whether Israel will be reactive and just continue to react to the attacks, or will take the initiative. Many say, though, many experts that I've interviewed as a journalist say that if there's a resolution of what's going on in Gaza, then Hezbollah will, pull back, and this could be settled and resolved without the all-out war. But right now, everyone's really on edge, and we'll see. We'll see what happens. Many say that the Israeli military is just waiting for things to come to some sort of resolution or end in Gaza, and then they'll turn to a north and perhaps initiate tensions there.
Alison Kaplan-Sommer, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. Time now for a roundup of the day's business stories with Ewan Potts from Bloomberg. Ewan, we've been reporting this morning on Boeing and all of the troubles there. We've been reporting on it for a number of days, for that matter. But you have a story about shares in Airbus also slumping this morning. What have they said to cause this?
Hello, Chris. Yeah, demand is booming at Airbus. The order book at the world's biggest playmaker is full, booked out years ahead. Its only other significant rival, Boeing, as you mentioned, is caught up in its worst crisis in decades. So should be happy days. But Airbus warned today that supply chain issues are stymieing its ability to fulfill all those orders. It says it's experiencing a shortage of engines, aerostructures and cabin interiors, among other parts. And it says the situation is getting worse rather than better. Airbus has long warned of the issue after the pandemic first upended the aviation industry and then left it totally unprepared once air travel came roaring back. You might think it was predictable, but that nobody was predicting it at the time. And what's new, I think, is the breadth of the problem. The CEO says that cabin parts, for example, are in short supply because airlines are refurbishing older planes, meaning those shipments don't come to Airbus. And as a result, the jet makers cut back a whole swathe of its targets. It now expects to hand over 770 aircraft this year rather than 800, and it's cut back on targets further ahead, and it's guided lower on profit expectations.
Just to follow that up quickly, Ewan, what does that mean then for airlines if they're struggling both with Boeing and its issues and with Airbus as well? Where are they going to get their planes from?
Well, it's a really fascinating sector. We all know the story of how effective they were during the pandemic for obvious reasons. And then there was that huge surge in demand, which stretched for a couple of years. And demand is still buoyant for air travel. So they've been hit both by massively increasing demand and constrained supply when it comes to planes and when it comes to staff. A number of the airlines laid off staff during the pandemic and regretted it pretty soon afterwards. I mean, ordering planes has always been a long-term business. You can't say, I'd like a new plane next year. Often you have to put in an order for 4 or 5 years down the line. But the queue for these planes is really quite enormous now. So if you want a new plane, you just can't have it anytime soon. Of course, there is a market for second-hand planes, which tend to be less efficient. But if you want to ramp up your capacity, if you're Ryanair or EasyJet in Europe, then you have to rein back those plans because the planes are just not there.
Just finally as well, Ewan, before we let you go, there's a quick update on the chip maker NVIDIA, the world's most valuable company.
Yeah, we reported on the show about the chip maker that was caught up in the AI boom, NVIDIA, and how it had become the world's most valuable company. Well, today, Chris, that is no longer the case. NVIDIA shares have dropped by 13% over the last 3 trading sessions, and that's wiped $430 billion from their value. It's actually the biggest drop over such a short period of time in history. Now, there's actually no obvious bad news to speak of, but the shares were in what we call overbought territory. And sometimes after a massive run higher, stocks just need to take a breather. And that's seen the company drop below Microsoft and Apple in the league of the world's most valuable companies. But despite the sell-off, the shares are still up 140% so far this year. So no need to shed too many tears for investors.
I suppose, does that mean they just sort of couldn't handle the limelight? Is that what you're suggesting, Ewan?
Well, something like that. I mean, I think most analysts are still very, very, very bullish on NVIDIA. It's a company which has grown its revenues enormously over the last few years as it's kind of cornered the market in these AI chips. So I think positivity is still abounding with this stock. But sometimes after these enormous runs, investors just take a bit of a breather.
Ewan Potts, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. Here in the UK, royalty is welcoming royalty as the Japanese Emperor Naruhito visits London this week. The Emperor will be celebrated with a banquet hosted by King Charles, but before that, he's been getting to know his roots. He's long known as something of an Anglophile and a graduate of Oxford University, where he studied commerce on the river. The Emperor is, among other things, getting a tour of the Thames, therefore. Richard Lloyd-Parry, the Times Asia editor, joins us now for more on this trip. Richard, great to have you on the show. Before Emperor Naruhito left, he actually spoke about some of the thorny problems of essentially running out of heirs. Let's start with that.
Yes, I mean, he didn't make heavy weather of it, but it was significant that he acknowledged that there is a problem. The Japanese emperor, by constitutional mandate, really avoids getting involved in any kind of politics, and he's a master of avoiding the controversial and embracing the mild and, in some ways, the obvious. But even he can't deny now that the imperial family has a problem. The problem is that only a boy descended from an emperor directly can inherit the throne, and they're running out of boys. They have a surfeit of women, but only about 4 boys, and one of them is in his 90s. So that's a real problem that Japanese politicians are debating and discussing ways of overcoming. And in the press conference that he gave just before his trip to the UK, which I attended, the emperor touched on this and mentioned it and acknowledged it, but he didn't go into a lot of detail. In fact, he said, I can't talk about it because it's a political matter.
Well, fair enough. It is a sensitive issue over there, that's for sure. But let's move on to this trip to the UK. Tell us about the Emperor's London plans and really what they say about him and what the UK means to him.
Well, of course, it's not just about him. It's a state visit. He's going there not because he's decided to have a holiday, but because the Japanese government has decided it's a good thing. And it comes at a time when relations between Britain and Japan are probably, closer and stronger than they have been since before the Second World War. There are a lot of exchanges, a lot of security exchanges when the HMS Queen Elizabeth, the Britain's new aircraft carrier, made its maiden voyage, its first destination of Tokyo. Training going on between the two sides. They're working together on developing a new fighter jet with Italy. So that's the background to it. But as well as that, it's certainly the case that for the Emperor and Empress Masako as well, Britain is an important place. I mean, the two royal families have had a close relationship going back to Queen Elizabeth's coronation, when Naruhito's father, Akihito, then a young man and the Crown Prince, travelled and attended the coronation very, very few years, only 7 years after the end of the Second World War, and all the ill feeling towards the Japan that generated in Britain. But also Naruhito and Masako, as you say, both studied as postgraduates at Oxford University. And the Emperor later wrote a book about it called The Thames and I, a memoir of 2 years at Oxford, where it was made very clear that this was a time of great happiness in his life, and not just happiness, a time of rare freedom where he could pass, pretty much as just another guy at the university. No one knew who he was. He was anonymous.
Richard, thank you very much for joining us. That was Richard Lloyd Parry, the Times Asia editor. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing, and finally on today's show, the race to the moon is back on. China's space program has been among the pioneers. Its Chang'e 6 lunar probe has just landed back on Earth, carrying lunar soil with it from the Aitken Basin that could potentially lead to some new scientific discoveries or understandings. Well, joining me now is Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue, and Dr. Chris Smith, a virologist from Cambridge University and founder of the Naked Scientists podcast. Great to have you both on the show. Chris, I'll start with you. What is in this soil? We don't even know exactly how much they brought back, do we? But why do we care?
We're hoping that aboard the craft is 2 kilos of rock samples. They've been retrieved from this South Pole Aitken Basin, which is one of the oldest, we believe, and one of the largest impact craters, both on the moon, but also in the solar system. And that tells us quite a bit because it's very deep and high energy, which means it may have excavated as far down into the moon's surface as its mantle. So when you have these big impact craters, you disclose material which we can't get at by scratching the surface. But if nature does it for us, it discloses material that would otherwise be inaccessible. So you see a very deep timeline, and that's why they've aimed for this particular area. It's on the far side of the moon that we haven't been to apart from indirectly, and it's very, very deep, which means we're getting deep into the moon to see a big cross-section of its geology.
Now, Isabel, to come to you on this as well, the fact that China is making these discoveries that Chris is describing there, bringing back these lunar soil and rocks, I mean, they're quickly becoming an expert, I suppose, on lunar probe landings. This isn't the first. What does this mean to them?
It's huge. I mean, what it does for China's global image, what it does for the party propaganda at home. I mean, it's essentially saying, China is now, it cannot be disputed that China is a leading scientific power, and that has been a strategic ambition for the government for some years now. Now, it's a mixed ambition. It's partly about building a kind of strong science and technology sector for purposes, for the economic purposes, but it's also a strategic and security bid. they don't intend just to pop into the moon and pop back again. There is a longer term establishing a more permanent presence on the moon program. That is an ambition. There's also an ambition to explore what could be mined from the moon. So, this is a serious program, and it is one in which I think China can now claim to be a very serious player. It has suspicions about the US ambitions for the moon. The US has ambitions about the Chinese suspicions for the moon. So what we're now in is a kind of strategic space competition with both civil and military overtones.
Chris, I suppose this is one of the strange aspects of missions like this. You have, on the one hand, the sort of geopolitical aspects of this, suspicions that Isabel was describing there. But what is the actual, I suppose, sort of holy grail of the moon for scientists, taking out that geopolitics? What is the kind of biggest unanswered question or possible scientific achievement that can be gleaned from these trips?
People are looking a bit like the Wild West for the best place to establish base camp. You want to have a first past the post advantage. You want to be the first on the ground. Choose your site carefully. Choose your site that will give you access to the best resources, the best views of space, because the moon isn't just a great place to launch space missions because of the lower gravity than on Earth. It's a great source of raw materials and a great vantage point through which to survey the solar system and beyond, because it's very, very cold, no atmosphere to disturb your optics of your telescope, and nothing else in the way. So there are lots of strategic advantages to being there, but you've got to choose your site carefully. People have spent a long time poring over the surface of the moon that we can see, because remember, the moon is tidally locked to the Earth, so it shows us the same face all the time. We don't get to see the so-called dark side. It's called dark because it's our knowledge that's dark. It's obviously fully illuminated by the sun most parts of its cycle around the Earth. But if you learn something about that far side that no one spotted before, not just about the geology, that's academically very interesting, but strategically in terms of raw materials, other things you can do, places you could build base camp, because that's on China's agenda, as Isabel was saying. They want to have a permanent base there in the future, but people on the moon by 2030, where are they going to put them? Well, this is all part of a prelude to building up to that ambition.
Just to follow that up quickly, Chris, tell us more about these raw materials. I mean, what are we actually expecting to find on the moon? This is, after all, a place that at one time we had completely abandoned.
The moon was made about 4.57 billion years ago by a massive impact between a Mars-sized planet and the Earth, which ejected huge amounts of the Earth's crust material into space, which coalesced to form the moon. The moon has subsequently been bombarded on its far side by impactors coming in from space, so there's a lot to be learned about what they brought in. But there are materials there which are easier to access than they are on the Earth's surface, and the relative abundances of some of those materials may be a bit different. There's also a lot of water. So if you choose your site carefully, you've got the things we need for keeping a base going: light for solar, raw materials for building stuff, water for keeping our astronauts both nourished in terms of water, but also you can electrolyze water by passing current through it. You can produce oxygen and hydrogen. You have an energy supply that's chemical and storable. So there's all kinds of things that we want to know, not just about the interesting academic aspects of the moon and its origins and its history and what it can reveal to us about the Earth's formation, but also strategically about what might be lurking there for mineral recovery, because people are talking about getting raw materials from the moon and beyond, even asteroids, and then refining them and having space foundries, floating foundries, where we do interesting casting and all kinds of metallurgy that's much more difficult to do on Earth, but you can do it in space with lower gravity, and for various reasons why you might want to do that. And then you build stuff there rather than have to cart it all the way up there from the Earth, which saves you an enormous amount of both stress and the risk of doing this, but then you can easily get your things into space because the gravity is much lower.
It's quite extraordinary to think about finding things on the moon being easier to excavate than here on Earth. But Isabel, just to end with you, I mean, when you talk about the skepticism of China and the US for sort of what both of their interests are here, and then at the same time, Chris talks about all of this potential that the moon has, I just wonder if you get any sense that there will be cooperation as China becomes this serious player in space. Will they play nice with NASA, or are they going to be doing their own thing entirely?
I think they're certainly going to try to maintain what looks like a lead at the moment. NASA has been underfunded in this regard, and it remains to be seen whether the US will be stimulated by this to put the kind of funding in that is required on the program. A more immediate question, which might be a bellwether for whether there will be cooperation, is the fate of the International Space Station, which is, coming to the end of its life. And there is at present no immediate substitute, but there is a China space station project and a Russia space station project, so there's collaboration there. Whether this will be open to the United States will be one signal, I think, of whether we're going to see unmitigated competition or cooperation in space.
Very interesting. We're going to have to leave it there. That was Isabel Hilton and Chris Smith as well. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Vincent McAvinney. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid and George Ruskin. And our studio manager was Flynn Simons, with editing assistance from Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.